Okay, so here is the first video for Chapter 24, which is Diseases of the Respiratory System. So the respiratory system is one of the body systems that are covered in A&P2. We're not going to spend a lot of time on the anatomy and physiology of the system, but one thing that's very important in our class, not only is it a major portal of entry, it is the number one portal of entry for microorganisms. So every time you breathe in, not only are you breathing in air, but you're breathing in dust and dirt particles that contain bacteria, viruses, fungus. You're inhaling the bacteria, the viruses, the mold spores that are in the air. So obviously, portals of entry is a very important topic for us, and the respiratory system is definitely the number one portal of entry for microorganisms, obviously pathogens. So there are diseases that target other systems of the body, but enter via the respiratory system. Um, but of course, most of the pathogens that we inhale directly attack some part of our respiratory system, which makes sense. So if you breathe it in, it's going to most likely go after somewhere in that system. But certainly, there are other things that we could potentially breathe in that can get into the blood and spread elsewhere. So the upper respiratory tract is comprised of the nose and nasal cavity, the oral cavity, and the pharynx. And obviously, we want to try to filter out as many microorganisms as possible. So we have nose hairs, which obviously trap a lot of the particles and dust and debris that we breathe in. Um, the nasal cavity, of course, is also lined with mucous membrane. So the goblet cells produce the mucus to try to trap various different types of particles. Obviously, oral cavity and pharynx is when we swallow, the material will go down to the stomach and get destroyed. So we've talked a lot about the ciliated pseudostratified epithelium, um, which the cilia basically act as a filter to trap various particles and various things, and then the goblet cells will kind of produce the mucus. The mucus washes over those cilia that kind of traps everything like sticky fly paper. And then when you clear your throat, the kind of that ball of mucus with all the bad, gross stuff kind of comes up into your throat. You swallow it or you spit it out, and then you don't have to worry about any of those microbes or pathogens anymore. So the parts of the lower respiratory tract, which is the trachea, the bronchi, the lungs themselves, and the alveoli, which are the air sacs, um, they are, well, at least the upper parts are rich with that pseudostratified ciliated epithelium. As you get deeper down into the system, you start to lose that, but then you have things like macrophages and neutrophils, which will patrol those areas for infection, and hopefully do their best to phagocytize the pathogen. So of course we want our alveoli to be as sterile as possible, because any type of inflammation, any type of infection can cause issues with our breathing, our ability to not only take in oxygen, but also to get rid of carbon dioxide. So, common upper respiratory infections, a lot of these are probably going to sound very familiar. Treat these as vocabulary words, although for the most part they're pretty easy. So pharyngitis is inflammation of the throat. Laryngitis is inflammation of the larynx or voice box. Tonsillitis is inflammation of the tonsils. Sinusitis is inflammation of the sinuses. And epiglottitis is inflammation of the epiglottis. So again, these are pretty easy terms for you to know for the test. Epiglottitis is by far the most dangerous because the epiglottis is the flap of tissue that closes off your trachea when you swallow. So you can imagine if you have problems with your epiglottis, when it's inflamed or swollen or painful, you can actually choke when you try to swallow your food. So that can be extremely dangerous. So certainly out of this list of 5, epiglottitis is the most dangerous. And then there's various different types of microorganisms can cause any or all of these. You can have gram positive, you can have gram negative, you can have bacteria, you can have viruses. Even some of this stuff could be linked to allergies. So it's a lot to get into. We're only going to talk about a few very specific diseases that are associated with these common infections. But lots of different organisms, different types of microbes can cause these conditions. So we finally get to talk about this one. It probably seems like we have talked about this so much, but we've actually not had it typed out in a PowerPoint. And we're talking strep throat. So we have talked since day 1 about Streptococcus pyogenes. We've talked about what a dangerous bacteria it is. We've talked about all the different things it can do. And finally, one of the main diseases is streptococcal pharyngitis, which is the technical term for strep throat. So we know that Streptococcus pyogenes has special enzymes. Some of those enzymes allow it to be beta hemolytic, which means it can break down the red blood cells and basically destroy the blood itself. It's highly resistant to phagocytosis, so it's very hard for our bodies to kill. And it likes to spread to other parts of the body. So I've said this before and I'll say it again. If you have strep throat, you've got to go to the doctor. You've got to get on antibiotics because your body by itself is probably not going to be able to fight off the infection. It can spread to your heart. It can cause all kinds of inflammatory conditions. It's especially dangerous with children, dangerous for people with compromised immune systems. But it's just interesting how we've talked so much about strep throat and strep pyogenes, and yet we haven't had it until now in terms of in the PowerPoint. So certainly you should know the technical term. Streptococcal pharyngitis is strep throat. Scarlet fever is when strep throat is accompanied by a red rash. So it'll actually look somewhat similar to measles, but it's actually when the strep pyogenes is actively making a toxin, and the toxin causes an inflammatory rash to appear on the skin. So it's very common for children when they get strep throat that they'll also get a red rash, and then often the parents will think chickenpox or measles, but it's actually just the strep throat causing the rash. So that's what scarlet fever is. Don't get scarlet fever confused with rheumatic fever, even though they are both caused by strep pyogenes. They're two very different conditions, and rheumatic fever, of course, is much more dangerous than scarlet fever. Diphtheria is probably a respiratory disease you haven't really heard of because of the vaccine. So there's a vaccine that's been in use in the US for a long time, and it's really gotten the numbers of the people who get this disease very low. Gram positive, Corynebacterium diphtheriae, sore throat, fever. If you look at the book, I think there's still a picture in the book about you get kind of this membranous kind of coating on the back of the throat, and it looks really kind of gross. And again, very rare disease in the United States due to vaccination. Otitis media, middle ear infections, when pus will actually build up behind the eardrum, which is very, very painful. This can be caused by all kinds of different types of bacteria, strep pyogenes being one of them, but it's just one of the other conditions that we kind of include here as being an upper respiratory disease from bacteria. So the major upper respiratory disease caused by virus is the common cold. And there's actually many viruses that can cause the common cold, and about half of all colds in humans are caused by rhinovirus. So the term rhino actually means nose, and that's how it got its name. So other animals, it is different, but for humans, about half of all colds, viral upper respiratory colds, are caused by rhinovirus. Now, of course, I very briefly mentioned coronaviruses in this chapter, and now, we have this pandemic going on with this new coronavirus. It's really amazing. I haven't updated my PowerPoint quite yet. I'm just going to kind of talk about it here, and actually it pops up in another place, so we'll talk more about it there. But there are a few other viruses that cause colds. Most of the time, if you have a cold, the doctor's just going to tell you to go home, to rest, stay hydrated. All this time, I mean, we talked about the history of microbiology. We talked about, the germ theory, how the germ theory was proven, the discovery of antibiotics, the advent of vaccines, and yet we still just do not have hardly anything useful that we can do against the common cold. It's really kind of crazy. So there are colds caused by different types of coronaviruses, different types of adenoviruses, and sometimes colds are, they're just an unknown kind of cause to them. Maybe it's a, virus that we haven't discovered yet, but it is, pretty fascinating how we have all these different things. So symptoms of a cold: sneezing, runny nose, congestion, can spread to the throat, the sinuses, and then if the person has a weakened immune system, can certainly go down to the lower respiratory tract, cause things like bronchitis, pneumonia. It's just one of those things that we've been battling for a very long time as a species. Our dogs and cats get colds as well. Dogs and cats tend to get colds from adenoviruses more than rhinoviruses. It just so happens that, humans, rhinoviruses are kind of the go-to thing. A lot of times it's coronaviruses will usually go after birds. Sometimes cats more than humans. We just happen to have this new coronavirus going on. The common cold is definitely an umbrella term for all kinds of different viral diseases that we can't really do a darn thing about, as well as some unknown causes. So there you go. That's the common cold. Let's see if we have time to get through these. I think that we should. So diseases of the lower respiratory system, obviously bronchitis and pneumonia can be caused by all kinds of different things, different bacteria, different viruses. Some other specific diseases, we're definitely going to talk about whooping cough or pertussis. Absolutely going to talk about tuberculosis. Definitely going to talk about different types of pneumonia. We won't talk about amyloidosis. You can read more about that in your book. We're just not going to talk about that one in the PowerPoint. And I think that's it. So we will pick up with the next slide in the next video.